People who grew up in the 1970 seconds carry a kind of psychology that's strangely hard to explain to anyone born after the 2000s. Not because one generation is better than the other, but because they were shaped by completely different rules of childhood. Back then, silence was normal. Freedom came early. Danger wasn't hidden. And childhood looked so unstructured that, by today's standards, it would probably trigger panic, lawsuits, or social services. Yet somehow, that environment produced adults who still think, argue, trust, love, and survive in a very specific way. There's a quiet confidence inside them, a sense of, I'll figure it out, that never really leaves. But here's the part most people miss. That same mindset came with a psychological cost that almost no one talks about, and understanding it explains far more than nostalgia ever could. They grew up in a world with almost no supervision, and that wasn't a metaphor, it was daily life. You left the house in the morning with a bike, a few friends, and a loose promise to be home before it got dark. And that was enough. No phones, no GPS, no constant check-ins. If you disappeared for 5 hours, nobody assumed the worst. You learned directions by getting lost. You learned limits by crossing them. Psychologically, this trains something rare today, an internal sense of navigation, the belief that even without instructions, you could still move forward. That's where the quiet voice comes from, the one that says, I'll figure it out, even when there's no clear plan. It sounds healthy, and in many ways it was. But freedom that early doesn't just build confidence, it also teaches the brain that help is not guaranteed. And when help isn't guaranteed, independence becomes survival, not a choice. Most people from the 1970 seconds were raised by parents who carried memories they rarely spoke about. War, rationing, real hunger, real fear, or at least the emotional aftermath of it. These were parents who didn't explain stress. They embodied it. They didn't process emotions out loud, they absorbed them and kept moving. Love was shown through work, sacrifice, and presence, not through constant reassurance. As children, they learned responsibility not as a lesson, but as an atmosphere. You felt it in the way adults carried themselves, in the expectation that you would contribute, adapt, and not fall apart over small things. This is why people from that era often matured earlier, not because they were wiser, but because their environment didn't leave space for emotional delay. Survival wasn't discussed, it was modeled, quietly and consistently. They grew up fixing things instead of replacing them, adapting instead of panicking, and learning through mistakes that couldn't be undone with a reset button. When something broke, you didn't wait for someone else to solve it. You picked it apart, tried again, and lived with the outcome. That repetition trained the brain to tolerate friction. Problems weren't emergencies, they were normal. Psychologically, this built a nervous system that could stay steady under pressure, a mind that didn't immediately search for rescue. But there was a trade-off. A brain trained to endure also learns to stay quiet. It learns to push through discomfort without naming it. Strength became synonymous with silence, and silence slowly became a habit. What looked like resilience on the outside was often emotional compression on the inside, and that compression would matter later when the world began to change speed. They became known for being calm, grounded, and hard to shake. People trusted them because they didn't overreact, didn't dramatize, didn't collapse when things went wrong. That steadiness became their identity. But psychologically, calm doesn't mean untouched. When emotions aren't named, they don't disappear, they go underground. Many from this generation learned how to carry stress without leaking it, how to function without processing, how to keep going without stopping to ask what something cost them internally. The world rewarded that behavior for a long time, until the pace of life accelerated, until silence stopped being neutral and started becoming isolating. What once looked like emotional strength slowly turned into emotional distance, not because they lacked feeling, but because they were never taught how to unpack it out loud. They stood in a strange position, with one foot planted in a world that moved slowly and demanded patience, and the other stepping into a world that suddenly became fast, loud, and digital. They remembered life before constant screens, before notifications pulled attention every few seconds, before silence felt uncomfortable. At the same time, they were forced to adapt to a system that rewarded speed, visibility, and constant responsiveness. Psychologically, this made them a bridge generation, but bridges carry weight from both sides. They weren't raised to manage overload, yet they were expected to function inside it. They weren't trained to narrate their inner world, yet the culture around them began demanding emotional transparency. They adapted, like they always had, but adaptation doesn't mean alignment. And while they were learning to survive this new pace, a generation was being born directly into it. They were born into a world already vibrating with information. Screens weren't introduced later. They were always there, glowing in the background of childhood, shaping attention before attention had a chance to stabilize. Notifications, videos, messages, timelines, all arriving faster than the brain could fully process. From a psychological standpoint, this meant the post-2000s brain learned stimulation before it learned stillness. Their nervous system grew up running near full speed, absorbing more input in a single day than earlier generations encountered in an entire week. This didn't make them weak, it made them different, but it did come with a cost. Focus became fragmented, rest became shallow, and the mind learned to stay alert even when the body wanted to slow down. When stimulation never turns off, exhaustion doesn't feel dramatic, it feels normal. They grew up comparing without meaning to, measuring themselves against timelines they never chose. Social media didn't just offer connection, it quietly turned everyday life into a performance metric. Achievement, appearance, happiness, even rest, all became visible, scrollable, and silently ranked. Psychologically, the brain isn't built to witness thousands of reference points every day. Yet, that's exactly what this generation experiences. The result isn't laziness or fragility, it's cognitive fatigue. Attention drains faster, motivation flickers, and even moments meant for recovery get interrupted by the urge to check, refresh, or respond. The mind never fully powers down because the environment never stops asking for awareness. This generation is intelligent, creative, and emotionally aware, but they are also carrying a level of mental load that previous generations never had to metabolize. What often gets overlooked is that growing up inside that pressure reshaped their strengths, not just their struggles. They developed a language for emotions that older generations never needed or were never allowed to learn. They can name anxiety, burnout, dissociation, and overwhelm with a precision that once didn't exist in everyday conversation. Psychologically, this gives them faster emotional recognition and a higher sensitivity to internal states. They adapt quickly, read patterns fast, and sense instability early, because instability has always been part of their environment. They may not endure silently, but they are skilled at identifying when something is wrong. Their strength isn't toughness in the traditional sense, it's awareness. And awareness, when guided, becomes resilience instead of rumination. Still, every strength carries a vulnerability, just like every generation before them. The psychological truth most generations miss is this. The hardest generation isn't the one that suffered the most, it's the one forced to unlearn what once kept them alive. People from the 1,970 seconds were shaped by endurance, self-reliance, and emotional restraint, and those traits helped them survive a slower, harsher world. But in a fast, emotionally exposed society, that same silence can turn into isolation. Meanwhile, the post-2000s generation grew up hyper-aware, emotionally fluent, and mentally overstimulated, which helps them navigate complexity, but leaves them vulnerable to burnout. Every generation breaks in a different place. One struggles to speak, the other struggles to rest, and neither problem exists because something went wrong. It exists because the world changed faster than human psychology ever could. In the end, this isn't about deciding which generation had it harder or who turned out stronger. It's about understanding what your environment trained you to do without asking your permission. Did your childhood teach you how to survive without help, or how to process emotions in a world that never slows down? Did it reward silence or awareness, speed or endurance? Every generation carries a psychological imprint, and that imprint quietly shapes how you love, work, argue, and recover. Understanding it isn't about blame, it's about clarity. Because once you see the pattern, you stop fighting yourself for being the way you are. You start adjusting instead of judging. If this made you reflect on your own upbringing, share which side you grew up on, before 1980 or after. And if you're drawn to conversations that go deeper than surface-level motivation, stay here. We unpack the psychology beneath everyday life, one layer at a time.